For the month of January, I had decided to put God on trial for crimes against humanity, based on the book I just wrote in July, Setting God Free, Moving Beyond the Caricature We've Created in Our Own Image. And so last week, I presented the case for the prosecution, and I brought in 3 expert witnesses. I brought in a Bible scholar, I brought in a clinical psychologist, and I brought in a contract lawyer to lay the case for this pathological, genocidal maniac that we call God. Today and next Sunday, I'm going to introduce the defense. I'll break it into 2 parts today. I'm going to introduce another Bible scholar and a kind of an archaeologist. And then next Sunday, I'm going to talk about a mythologist and a Jungian analyst to present the case for the defense. So the reading I've chosen is from the introductory remarks of the defense attorney, a woman called Kayla Goldstein, and she's making her introductory remarks before she presents the case for the defense. I've titled it, Heaven Countersues, Humans Charged with taking God's name in vain. Kayla Goldstein's presence was highly collegial through the prosecution's detailed presentations. Even when the expert witnesses attacked her client's very character without mercy. The defense calmly absorbed every bit of the prosecution's vitriol without even blinking. Her calm demeanor could almost be seen as lackadaisical. But we're about to see all of that change as Kayla Goldstein takes command of the courtroom in a brilliant defense of God. For the last 6 days, we have listened to the carefully culled, impressive evidence presented by the learned attorney for the prosecution. My esteemed colleague, Michael Newsom, has done a stellar job assembling the many damning pieces of evidence, recreating the many crimes, and telling all of the lurid details. The monster he describes surely deserves to be held accountable for his deeds. Although I rarely advocate for capital punishment, our world indeed would be far better off without such a brutal God as this. However, I intend to show you beyond any doubt that the crimes, the very real and stomach-churning crimes the prosecution has presented, are attributed to a totally innocent defendant. I do not dispute that such horrendous deeds do indeed occur in this world, but I will prove to you that the person on trial today did not commit them, any of them. Imagine, if you will, faithful jurors, that I had written a novel in which the chief protagonist dictates his autobiography to one of his henchmen, who was at once his scribe, the chief witness to many of his crimes, and a willing enforcer of other crimes committed at his command. Some years later, a diligent investigator comes upon this record. The investigator has had a long, successful career in solving and prosecuting similar crimes. So he has resolved to bring the protagonist to justice. For some reason, he is unaware that this autobiography is a work of fiction. And he pursues the case all the way to a live trial. The problem is that both the protagonist and his scribe do not know, nor ever have, existed. So here we sit today, having been buffeted by the strobe lights and stage sounds of a made-up drama, proving Shakespeare right in his assessment that all the world's a stage. In defense of Yahweh, I will show you that the scribe, witness, and enforcer called Moses never in fact existed, and that the main saga of an escaped slave race being led across the desert by a bloodthirsty wannabe god is part of a human-created projection that was designed to answer the human questions of the day. The resultant historical novel, however, is neither historical nor novel. It is a well-crafted fable based on the oft-manifested archetype of the projected human shadow. Words inspired by God. We have a proverb in Irish that says, Rawa idir char dao. Rawa idir char dao. Translated into English, literally it means a choice between 2 blind goats. And the backstory to it is a lazy farmer who on market day, which only happens once a month in his nearby town, is very, very late to the market, and he wanted to buy a goat. When he gets to the market, however, all of the goats have been sold, all of the cattle have been sold, and there are just 2 goats left. And both of them are blind. So his choice is between 2 blind goats. Now, farmers in Ireland use goats to lead cattle and to eat stuff that's bad for the cattle, but the goats can eat it. So it's very, very important that the goat be sighted. So he's got a choice between 2 blind goats. The English equivalent to that might be something like stuck between the devil and the deep blue sea, or stuck between a rock and a hard place, or damned if you do and damned if you don't. And that is the situation in which many Judeo-Christians find themselves. An example of that was what I mentioned last week at the end of the homily, the Stockholm Syndrome. And it's a situation in which people who are captives bond with their captors in order to try to survive psychologically. But in the case of the Stockholm Syndrome, bank robbers who robbed a bank took 4 captives. And there's a siege that went on for several days. And finally, the police broke in to free them. But when they were freed, the 4 captives refused to give evidence against their captors. Not just because they had bonded with them, but because the police were so brutal, they were fixated on catching the criminals, and they really didn't give a damn about the captives. So the captives were so badly treated in the course of the rescue that they refused to give evidence against their captors. Now, what does this mean? It meant for me that in some senses, we find ourselves in the very same situation. We've been worshiping a God for centuries that is really a psychopath. We're captives to this God. But those who are attempting to set us free are far worse. They're brutalizing us. The atheists who don't believe in this character of God are worse than the character itself, because they're offering us a world of meaninglessness. And so we find ourselves oscillating between these. Are we better off serving this genocidal maniac that we call God, or follow the atheists who are leading us into meaningless lives? In some senses, it's a tug of war between fear-based fundamentalism and meaningless atheism. It's almost like a Sophie's choice. So I want to make just 3 main points on this morning. I'll do a brief introduction to the homily, and then I'm going to introduce another Bible scholar, and I'll divide his testimony into 2 parts. He's going to lead us through the history of the Israelites themselves, and therefore the development of the Bible. And then secondly, he's going to come to his own conclusion. And the second witness I'll introduce is an archaeologist, an Israeli archaeologist, a Sabra. So that's what I'll do this morning with God's help. So a brief introduction then. Last Sunday, as I said, I put God on trial for crimes against humanity, and I called these 3 expert witnesses. A Bible scholar who led us through particularly the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, to show us the murders and the genocides and the animal slaughter committed by this God and even mandated by this God on his followers. And I introduced a clinical psychologist who did a mental status examination of this God and found it to be absolutely pathological. And then I brought in a contract lawyer to show that this God frequently broke the covenant that he'd made with his chosen people. And the conclusion was then, it was very, very obvious from the prosecution's case that this God was guilty on all counts. But I remember the very famous 4 mock trials. In the last 24 hours of Jesus' life, he was subjected to 4 what I can consider mock trials. Firstly, in front of the high priest, who accused him of blasphemy, and then in front of Pilate, who found him just a mere annoyance. And Pilate handed him over to Herod, and Herod found him just to be a buffoon and sent him back to Pilate. And then Pilate figured out, okay, let's get this over with. Let's see, crucify the guy. And so it may well have been one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in all of human history. And so I made the decision that I'm going to give God a fair trial. I presented the prosecution last week, and now I'm going to present the defense. So that's my introductory remarks. This Bible scholar, who's also a Sabra, which means a native-born Israeli, is going to give us a history of the Israelites. And woven into that, you will understand how the Bible itself emerged from this extraordinary people. So I'm going to begin with the capture of Jerusalem in the year 1010 BCE. David conquered Jerusalem, which was a Canaanite city. And he conquered it in 1010 BCE. His son Solomon, in the year about 950 BCE, built the very first temple in Jerusalem. And at this stage, the Israelites in Jerusalem begin compiling stories of their God, a God whom they will call Yahweh. So since it was German scholars who initially kind of spoke in great detail about this, they called him J for Yahweh, but in German, J and Y interchangeable. There isn't a J in Hebrew. It's a kind of a Y sound, Yud sound. And so at this stage, they begin compiling stories of the God that they believe in, a God called Yud He Vuf, the Tetragrammaton, or we would call it Yahweh. And so these stories begin about 950 BCE. In 933 BC, however, there was a split in the land of Israel, and 10 of the tribes secede. The 10 northern tribes secede, and there are 2 tribes left in the south, Judah and Benjamin. So the temple is in the south in Jerusalem. So the 10 northern tribes do not want their people going down to Jerusalem to worship. And so whereas in Judah, there is the temple and a priesthood and a king, in the northern kingdom, which is now called Israel, and the southern kingdom will be called Judah, the northern kingdom has to kind of rely on prophets. They're not in the priestly lineage, they don't have a priesthood, and they're not in the regal lineage. And in fact, of the next 19 kings of the northern kingdom, about 11 of them were assassinated by people who succeeded them. So there's a big split that happens there. About the year 750 BCE, the northern kingdom begin compiling their own stories of their God. And they call this God Elohim, which is actually a plural. And so it's translated very often as, the Lord or God. It doesn't mean that. Elohim literally means the powerful ones. It's a plural noun in Hebrew. And so they make up stories about these powerful ones, these, divine beings who reside in the heavens or in the skies. And this one then is called, this part of the scriptures is called the E trajectory. They also begin compiling laws that they were now called Deuteronomy, mean second law. And so they're ascribing this teaching to a fictitious character, whom I will talk about later. However, in the year 721 BCE, the great Assyrian Empire overcomes the northern kingdom of Israel, and the 10 tribes are deported, and they fade from history. They are never heard of again. So now there's only 2 tribes left in the south, Judah and Benjamin. Now, before they escaped, some of the scholars from the northern kingdom of Israel escaped to the southern kingdom of Judah, and they took the E tradition with them, and they partially developed the Deuteronomy tradition with them. And they put them in the temple in Jerusalem, but they were lost for about 120 years. And then there was a great renovation happened in the Jewish temple about the year 600, and they discovered the E scriptures and the D scriptures. And they now attributed these to Moses. Unfortunately, in the year 587 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, which in the meantime had overcome the Assyrian Empire, conquered the 2 last tribes of Judah and put them off into exile in Babylon. And so at this stage now, they're desperately trying to hold on to their integrity and their very existence. They do not want to go the way their brothers and sisters in the 10 northern tribes vanished. And so at this stage, they're trying to pull together all these biblical streams. And the scholars will call these J, E, D, and P. J are the scriptures in which God is referred to as Yud He Vuf, or Yahweh. E are the scriptures in which God is referred to as Elohim, the powerful ones. D is the second law, which is now attributed to a fictitious character called Moses. And they add another stream called P, or the priestly one, which is a whole other set of rituals, mandated rituals. And they try to pull these together into a combined work that scholars will then call JEDP. Now, in 539 BCE, the Persians overcame the Babylonians and set the last remnants of the Judeans free to go back to the land of Israel. And they go back 539 BCE, and beginning in 515 BCE, they begin to rebuild the temple, the second temple. Now, by the year 400 BCE, they decide to really redact and edit and combine all of this material into one kind of a book that they will call the Pentateuch. And so they're trying to put it all together and put them together. And it's very, very badly edited, because very, very often there are 2 or 3 versions of exactly the same story. And instead of trying to kind of make them fit each other, they just put them side by side. and you decide which version you want. So there are very contradictory notions, for instance, of the creation story and of the flood story, because they were just combined without being properly edited. And they applied two criteria to what would get included and what would not get included. This is about 400 BC. And the two criteria they used were that the originals had to have been written in Hebrew, even if they were subsequently translated. And they had to have been written before 400 BCE. And on the basis of those two criteria, they included books that shouldn't have got in, like Daniel. Daniel was written actually much later. And the book of Enoch was taken out because the original Hebrew was missing at that stage, but was subsequently found. And so using those two criteria, books got in that shouldn't have, and books got excluded that should have been included. By the year 330 BCE, Alexander the Great had conquered the land of Israel and all of the Middle East right across to the gates of India. And at this stage, this is the first time you get to hear of Moses in non-Jewish literature. There's a mention of Moses about 300 BCE in some of the Greek writings, but they're just talking about what they discovered when they conquered the land of Judah. So the very first mention of Moses outside of the scriptures comes from about 300 BCE, which would have been about 950 years after Moses' putative existence. In 187 BC, there's a Maccabean revolt against the Greek presence, and they overthrow the Greeks. But then in 70 BC, there's a civil war in Judah between two brothers, both of whom want to be king and high priest. And they invite in the Romans to settle the dispute, and the Romans stay for the next 500 years. So now we've jumped the gap now into the AD times, or current times. In 66 CE, the Judeans in Jerusalem revolted against Roman occupation, and there was a war went on for 4 years. And finally, in the year 70 CE or 70 AD, the second temple is destroyed. So that gives you a flavor for how the Bible actually was composed, or how it came to be, dovetailing with the history of this extraordinary people. So the Bible scholars' conclusion was that the Bible is a library. It is not a single book. In fact, the Greek term for it is called ta biblia, which means the books, plural, the books. And in the Hebrew scriptures, according to the Protestant version, there are 39 books. And according to the Catholic version, there are 46 books. There are 7 books of the Hebrew scriptures that are included by Catholics and excluded by Protestants. Now, it's all kinds of literature. It's a library of all kinds of literature. There's history there. There's poetry there. There's eschatology there, the study of, the last times, the end times. There's theology there. There's proverbs there. There are riddles there. So to think that you can open this book, crack it open, and read it any place you want and understand it is the same kind of ridiculous notion that you can take your Sunday newspaper, and there's a sports section, and there's a finance section, and there's a comic section, and there's a news section, and there's a gardening section. To think that you can open each part of it and read it with the same mindset. Unconsciously, as you move from section to section of the Sunday newspaper, you're employing a totally different mindset. You're not reading the comic section with the same sense as you're reading, for instance, the gardening section. And so that's the problem. People think that because the Bible is the real word of God, Joe Smith, or John Smith in the street can open it any place he wants and understand what it really, really means. So the truth is, the Hebrew scripts were written by hundreds of authors over a period of more than 600 years. And they consist of an ongoing conversation between faith communities and particular stories, some of which they invented, some of which they inherited, and some of which they updated. So it's an ongoing conversation, and we have to realize that. And if you actually attend, Shabbat services in a synagogue on Friday evenings, one of the beautiful hymns there is that they believe that Torah, or the law, was something they inherited, and they need to keep updating and making it relevant for current times. So that was the conclusion of the Bible scholar. I then brought in an archaeologist to try and understand, is there any archaeological evidence, for instance, for the existence of Moses or the existence of an Exodus? According to the context, the Exodus would have taken place around the year 1250 BCE. Now, at this stage, we're told that in the scriptures that 603,550 military men escaped from Egypt, Israelites, which would mean that if you count in the older men and the little boys and all the women, you're talking about at least 2 million people escaped. And somehow the Egyptians, who were fastidious record keepers, failed to record that 2 million slaves, escaped into the Sinai. Moreover, the Egyptian Empire owned the Sinai Desert at that stage, all the ways north to Turkey and all the ways east into Mesopotamia. And to think that 2 million people could be wandering around the Sinai Desert for 40 years and escape the notice of the Egyptians doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So we read in the book of Exodus that God was so upset with the Israelites' constant fetching that he decided that of the 603,550 military men who left Egypt, only 2 of them would actually survive to enter the promised land, a guy called Joshua and a guy called Caleb. So it means that you have 2 million plus bodies, not to mention all of the other animals that they went with, scattered around the Sinai Peninsula. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, when 4 Arab nations attacked Israel, and Israel struck back, and in 6 days they had ended the war, and they'd captured the Sinai Peninsula. And at that stage, hundreds of Israeli archaeologists descended on the Sinai to see if they could find evidence for the Exodus from their scriptural traditions. They didn't find a single bone of a human being during that period of time. Particularly, there was a huge search around Mount Sinai, where allegedly Moses was given the 10 Commandments, and where the Israelites had encamped for a period of a few years, just around the base of that mountain. There wasn't a single bone found there. And it's not because it's too long ago. They were able to find evidence of nomadic peoples who predated that because of their equipment right now. They found out as well that many of the towns which allegedly the Israelites occupied and destroyed during their 40-year safari across the desert, many of those towns did not exist at the time, or for hundreds of years afterwards. What you find, in fact, modern Israeli archaeology has come to the conclusion that the Israelites were themselves Canaanites. They were nomadic Canaanites who attacked settled towns of other Canaanites. And the only difference you find between settlements of other Canaanites and the Israelites is the absence of pig bones at sites. Obviously, there was a prohibition for the nomadic Israelites to eat pigs. So there's the only difference, dietary, and pottery, between the settled Canaanites and the nomadic Canaanites was the absence of pig bones. And so there was no Exodus as far as the archaeologists are concerned. Moreover, Moses as a character did not exist. He was invented in some senses during the Babylonian captivity, which was a real period in which the remnant of Judaism came back into the land of Israel. There was an Exodus, but it happened 700 years later. It happened from Babylon, beginning in the year 539 BC, back into the land of Israel. But in order to survive this captivity, the last 2 tribes, they needed a story to inspire them and a hero to believe in. And so they created what is possibly the greatest liberator of all time. If you look at the character of Moses and his effect, he may well have been the greatest liberator of all time. And so Moses was a fictitious character, and the Exodus didn't happen. But in fact, it may be the greatest story that never happened because of its results. Together with maybe the Christ event, it may be the most transformative story human beings have ever invented or told themselves. It has inspired countless hopeless individuals over 2,500 years. Individual people who were caught in untenable circumstances. This story has allowed them to liberate themselves, to believe in a hero figure that can liberate them from this. And it has proved to be the kind of the David and Goliath writ large, for where entire nations were able to throw off the shackles of slavery and captivity. So a fictional character and a fictional event, were probably the 2 most transformative events and stories in human history. Are they true? My definition of truth, I've shared with you many, many times. There's a big difference between fact and truth. Something can be factual but not truthful, and something can be truthful but not factual. Because my definition of truth is something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. So truth is not a question of factuality, it's a question of transforming, the ability to transform. And so while Moses never existed, and the Exodus never happened, It has this central story of Pesach for the Jews and of Easter for Christians. And in that sense, then, it is absolutely true. And so the defense now is claiming that God and Moses are innocent of the crimes attributed to them during a fictitious exodus by the prosecution. The prosecution accused a caricature of God and a fictitious Moses of crimes against humanity. And next Sunday, I will introduce the two final witnesses for the defense, a mythologist and a Jungian analyst, to show us that these criminals and this criminal behavior was a projection of the human shadow. And so now, as we dance between a pathological God, and meaningless atheism, there's a third way out. It's the transformative power of myth and story. And that will allow us to find out who the God really, the God in whose image we are created, rather than the character of God we've created in our own image and likeness from our shadow material. Namaste.